We're going to talk tonight about preparing for a new millennium, I was candid enough to be honest earlier about this particular session. I mean, ideally, what we're looking at tonight is that period of time from mid-'80s up until the year 2000 or thereabouts. As far as a time frame, when I structured the course chronologically, that's what I had in mind. And I mentioned a week or two ago that this particular session has been the one that's been the hardest for me, because this is the time frame in which I started preaching and started pastoring and got more involved. And so when I was trying to go back and look at the things that I thought were significant, the things to talk about, I lived it, and so it's and so I don't have the benefit of being able to look back and see from that perspective, from the outside perspective, like some of the other sessions, to know what's significant and what's important. And so in some ways, this particular session will probably be modified, by the course of time. The other thing that I found was, as we're wrapping up the history part of the course, is that there's still a lot of things that we hadn't talked about yet. And so in some ways, this is kind of a catch-all where we're going to cover some other things that we need to talk about but haven't talked about as of yet. But we're going to prepare for the new millennium, and first of all, we'll start that discussion by talking about some structural changes in the Church of God Mountain Assembly. There were some significant things that took place over the 20 years or so, the last 20 years or so of the decade or of the century that would prepare us for the new millennium, and I want to talk about them. Now, certainly they're not as significant as the changes that took place in 1944. But there are some things that, and they didn't all come at once. And so let's talk about some of them. Our discussion starts with the idea of the standard resolutions, and so let's talk about standard resolutions and talk about the work of the resolution committee. At the 1907 assembly, and I think I mentioned this a week or so ago, that the oldest committee we have in the Church of God Mountain Assembly is the resolution committee. It was formed there was a resolution committee in 1907. There's been a resolution committee every year since then. We've had a resolution committee even when we didn't have resolutions, when there were no new resolutions presented. And so in 1907, and from there on out, the assembly would meet together, and at the beginning of the week or during the course of the business, a resolution committee was appointed or was elected, and this committee would gather together. They would review the current minute book, the current resolutions, and they would propose new resolutions, or they would propose changes, or if somebody had an idea, they could suggest it to the committee, and then they would present it to the body. In 1964, the assembly voted to change the term of the resolution committee to 2 years, like all the other committees. All the other committees were being elected for every 2 years. And again, up until this time, the resolution committee was elected appointed or elected at the beginning of the assembly. They served for the assembly, and then their job was done. What year was that? 1964. So in 64, they started having a resolution committee that would be elected for a 2-year term, and their job would be to review the existing standard resolutions and to offer proposed changes for the General Assembly. That first year, because it's the first year we've done it, they elected a 10-member committee instead of the 3 that they've been having. After 1966, it would become 5, and that's what it is today, 5-member committee. In 1974, a change was made to allow any delegate to submit a resolution Any delegate was allowed to submit a resolution as long as each delegate was given a copy of the proposal in mimeograph form at the beginning of the General Assembly. And so anybody that wanted to propose a resolution you didn't have to be on the committee to propose one. You could write one as long as you made copies of it and brought it to all the delegates at the beginning of the business. In 1974, anyone was welcome to do that. They also specified or made a change that amendments, anything that changed the existing resolution, required 2/3 to make an amendment. And any new addition, if you just wanted to add something, if it did not affect something that was already in the resolutions, then it just required a simple majority. And that's still the case, that any new addition to the minute book is a simple majority, and any amendment, if you're changing something, then it requires 2/3. In 1984, 10 years later, the amendment procedure further changed. And so as of 1984, resolutions had to be submitted to the committee, and they had to be received by the committee postmarked by July the 1st. So the days of bringing a resolution to the assembly and having enough copies to pass out changed. You had to send the resolution to the committee by July 1st. That gave the committee time to review your proposal relative to the existing resolutions. They could discuss any needed changes with the presenter, and then at the General Assembly that year, the chairman of the committee would present the resolutions to the assembly in the form of a motion. And so the chairman, since 1984, has made a motion that we adopt this resolution and bring about the change. The standard resolutions became a part of the minute book in 1915. They went back and they pulled the best resolutions that had been adopted in 1907, 11, 12, 13, and 14. And what they did was they pulled the ones that would be best for the churches, things that ought to be retained. And so that in 1915, they chose, these are going to be standard resolutions. And so in 1917, at a ministers' meeting on November the 30th, 1917, the Church God Mountain Assembly officially adopted the church covenant and a list of articles of faith. Those both appeared in the minute book the following year. In 1925, from that time forward, the consistency of those resolutions appearing in the minute book year by year, that was solidified by 1925. So that every minute book since 1925, there's a list of standard resolutions that became our governing policy. Now, let me say this. If you submitted a new resolution that was added to the standard resolutions, it really didn't matter what the subject was about. It almost always got tacked on to the end of whatever, of what we already had. So that by the mid-1980s and 90s, the resolutions from beginning to end covered a wide variety of topics. Now, I think in the 1950s, when Clayton Lawson was general overseer, he and Brother Hatfield, the executive board, sat down and they started adding headings to the minute book. So that the first resolutions that maybe dealt with the general overseer, there was a heading that said general overseer. There might be 3 or 4 resolutions that dealt with that office, and then another heading, so that you could find things a little easier. But by the end of the book, there was a miscellaneous section, and you might have, there were actually some things that were more intended more to be teachings than there were any, and they were kind of tacked on to the end. And so it was a real challenge to be able to find something you were looking for, because it might be the number on it might not have anything to do. Number 74 may have nothing whatsoever to do with number 73, but something that was related to it might have been 52. And so by 1999, this became an issue for the assembly to look at, and so the resolution committee that year undertook the job of restructuring the standard resolutions into a constitutional declaration and bylaws. What they intended was to take everything that was in the minute book and not amend anything, but relocate so that the gist was all still there, but it was reorganized and restructured in such a way that you could find it more readily. The Resolution Committee from 1998 to 2000, by the way, Michael Cornelius was the chairman. Rick Massengill, Tim Walden, Alan Laws, and Euless Cox were that resolution committee that undertook that job. They met in Fairborn, Ohio in 1999 in the fall to discuss the work at hand, and then presented their work to the elder board in January for them to look at and to kind of give their seal of approval. And then it was presented to the General Assembly that year as a resolution to restructure the minute book as a constitutional declaration and bylaws. And so again, the task was taking everything that was in the resolutions and then sorting it out and lumping it together in places that make sense. The working model for the outline was the U.S. Constitution. We start the U.S. Article 1 of the Constitution is the legislative branch. Article 2 is the executive branch, and Article 3 is the judicial branch. And that's the way that our bylaws were structured. You start out talking about the general counsel and then move to the executive offices or the general officials, and then move to the judicial board, and then after that, the various departments of ministry before you get to an article on the district, and then an article on the local churches, and we'll talk more about that in the next to last session when we explore the bylaws and look at the polity of the Church of God Mountain Assembly. One thing that was added, that was recommended to the General Council, was adopted that year, was a statement of purpose. And so at the beginning of the Constitutional Declaration of Bylaws is a statement of purpose for the Church of God Mountain Assembly to promote, through the establishment of local churches, the expression of the worship of God, the exalting of the Lord Jesus Christ, experiencing the dynamics and fullness of the Holy Spirit, equipping and edification of believers for the propagation of the gospel by acknowledging and developing individual God-given gifts, calling, and talents. That's the, yes?
Is that still in the...
That statement of purpose is still at the beginning of our Constitutional Declaration of Bylaws.
That's 2000.
That's as of 2000. That statement of purpose was the one proposed by the committee and adopted adopted by the General Council. Another thing that was done that year also was the Declaration of Faith was added to the Constitutional Declaration of Bylaws. Prior to that time, we had an Articles of Faith had existed, and it was printed, at various times in the minute book. In the late 70s, it was printed in a promotional piece that the public relations director put together describing the Church of God Mountain Assembly. It had who we are, a little historical note, and it had some doctrinal information about our various ministries, and the Articles of Faith were in it. But it was but it had not been printed on a regular basis in our minute book annually, but it was added to the Constitutional Declaration and bylaws to be retained year after year as a part of that document, along with the teachings and the standard resolutions. Next week, when we look at the teachings, we'll start looking at the teachings next week, and we'll talk about specifically some of the teachings and the way that they have transformed. Some of the teachings started out as standard resolutions, and then ended up on the teachings page. And there were a few things that got moved in 2000 when the committee was trying to figure out where we're going to put stuff. Where does this fit? One thing in particular was we had a standard resolution since 1912 that said we shall not use the word Pentecost when referring to the Holy Ghost. And the committee said, where do we put this? It's under membership. Where does this? And so it got moved to the teachings page, and the question was asked in the committee meeting, or the statement was made in the committee meeting. The only concern I have is that once something becomes a teaching, then it almost becomes impossible to change or alter. It's almost etched in stone, and so that's no longer in the teachings page. But you can see the challenge of trying to figure out. Go back, and one of your homework assignments has you looking at the standard resolutions prior to the restructuring. I want you to see how they're laid out, and then look at the Constitutional Declaration and bylaws for comparison. And just imagine the challenge of trying to take, these 80 resolutions are numbered the way they are, and then reorganizing them in a way that makes sense, like what we've got today. Let's talk about some of the significant resolutions. One significant change happened in 1971. And it was the creation of a program committee by the General Council. Now, we talked about how in the early days of the Assembly, a Divine Services Committee would choose the speakers for that week. And so preachers were supposed to be instant in season and out of season. You just got to be ready. Come to the assembly with a sermon, because you may get picked to preach. And with the number of services and the number of different places where there might be preaching taking place, and there might be 3 services going on, and you pick whichever one you want to go to. Be ready was kind of the theme for every year's assembly. In 1953, the process was changed. A program committee would be elected at the last elders meeting before the General Assembly to prepare a program for the convention. And so the elders would choose a program committee, and they would call the speakers and have them be contacted. Announcements could be made in advance of who was going to be preaching. The youth and mission services were under the direction of the youth and missions directors for those services. So they would lead the service and choose the speaker and the prayer leader for the service in that regard. Now, I mentioned the introductory sermon here a little while back. The program committee, or the Divine Services Committee, would choose the other speakers, but the first sermon to the delegation or to the General Council, the introductory sermon, that was the message that was preached prior to business, was always elected the year before. They would choose somebody by ballot to preach next year's introductory sermon. That changed in 1964. So they would elect every year who's going to preach the introductory sermon next year. And in 1964, the General Council voted that year to have the General Overseer preach the introductory sermon every year. Now, you remember the restructuring that I talked about a couple weeks ago. In 1944, The restructuring in 1944 called for the Bishop's Council to meet on Tuesday morning, and the Bishop's Council would elect your overseers, and then the General Council would meet on Wednesday. The General Assembly would meet and conduct the rest of the business. So the General Overseer would preach on Wednesday morning prior to that General Assembly. Now, for some reason, even after we dropped the Bishop's Council and we went back to everybody participating in the business on Tuesday, the tradition of the introductory sermon remained Wednesday morning. So that by 1964, when the General Overseer was preaching the introductory sermon, it was Wednesday morning. And so if you go back and look at minutes from the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, the General Overseer is preaching on Wednesday morning. That's his morning every year. That's his service. He's preaching. And so originally the intention was for him to preach prior to the business, and then in 1997, when we voted to go to an all-days business session and have business on Tuesday, there wasn't a service at all on Tuesday morning. We actually had a couple of years where business was over before the introductory sermon was preached, and so that was a whole different dynamic. And of course, in 2011, at the end of the business that year, motion was made that the General Overseer preach Monday night. And so since 2012, now the General Overseer, the introductory sermon, has been moved to Monday night. So it is back before business again, and it's in the evening service, and he's preaching to more than just the bishops and more than just the delegates. And so the program committee now would choose the preachers and the prayer leaders and the devotion leaders. They would pick a theme, and no less than 3 months prior to the General Assembly have that program ready so that everybody knows well ahead of time who's preaching and which services and what have you. Another significant change, 1966, the Assembly added a succession of office resolution. If circumstances should cause the office of General Overseer to become vacant, the assistant would assume his duties until the next assembly. Now, that probably ought to go maybe without saying. That makes sense. But until 1966, it wasn't in writing anywhere. And so for the death or resignation or what have you of the General Overseer, there wasn't a process spelled out. You remember I talked about, and I know that the role of the moderator, his job was different than the role of the General Overseer. But we were transitioning toward that mindset where the moderator, his influence existed beyond just his ability to chair a business meeting. And he began to have a little more influence in local churches and what have you in the 20s. But in the 1920s, when basically the entire executive board went into the Church of God, we found ourselves in a position where somebody's got to step up and call the business together and get the ball rolling. And so in 1966, the Assembly saw, well, let's clear this up. Let's create this. Let's create this resolution. Now, if something happened to where both the General Overseer and the Assistant General Overseer's jobs became vacant, then the Board of Elders would meet and they would appoint men from their numbers, members of the Board of Elders, to assume the duties of the job or the jobs that were vacant until the next General Assembly. In 1994, the resignation of Wayne Halcomb, just a few weeks after the General Assembly, from the office of Youth Director, created another constitutional crisis. There was no provision given for succession of office in the National Youth Department. And so the General Overseer called the elders together to discuss that issue, and basically the decision was made. Well, General Overseer, you appoint, if you choose to, you appoint the assistant to move up until the next General Assembly and appoint somebody to become the next Assistant National Youth Director. And so he did. And so the need for clearer guidelines for succession of office became very apparent. And so in 1995, there was a resolution adopted to create succession for the youth department. And so under our current bylaws now, since 1995, if the National Youth Director's job office becomes vacant, then the assistant becomes the National Youth Director. Now, if he's unable to fulfill his duties, he's not able to or isn't interested in assuming that job, or if both jobs are vacant, then the General Overseer has the power to appoint someone subject to the approval of the camp board until the next General Assembly. And so the General Overseer would appoint subject to the approval of the camp board. Now, the same resolution also provided for the succession of office of the General Secretary and Treasurer. Surprisingly, it took this long to do something about that. And I'll say more about those circumstances in the next session. But in 1981, J.E. Hatfield died while he was serving as General Secretary and Treasurer. He died the week of the Assembly. And so there was no provision given for the Assistant General Secretary and Treasurer wasn't willing to assume the duties of General Secretary and Treasurer, and so it left the Assembly in a peculiar place. So again, this resolution in 1995 provided that if the General Secretary and Treasurer's job is vacant for death, resignation, whatever else, then the General Overseer can appoint a General Secretary and Treasurer subject to the approval of the Finance Committee to complete the rest of that year until the next General Assembly when an election can be conducted. And so the same thing is true with both of the assistants, and the idea is still with the General Overseer or the Assistant General Overseer, if one becomes vacant, then somebody from the Board of Elders is appointed until the next General Assembly to cover that. So that's the succession of office. 1969 saw the passage of a tenure of office resolution. Now, I talked some alluding to this in previous sessions about the fact that there was no tenure of office, and part of no term limits. And part of the conflict that erupted in 1946 and split the Assembly was because of that fact. And so you couldn't just wait around on somebody's term to be done. And if you wanted to serve in a capacity, you couldn't just wait around on your term because if somebody wanted to stay in office, they'd just keep running. Then they could. In 1969, the Assembly passed a tenure of office limitation that limited the general officials. It limited the executive board and the National Youth Ministries officers to 2 consecutive terms. And so a man could serve a total of 4 years in that capacity. He could also serve in another office on the executive board, for example. He can also serve a tenure there, but under no circumstances could any man serve more than 8 consecutive years on the executive board, or more than 8 consecutive years as a national youth official. So that, for example, if you'd serve you could be elected twice to Assistant National Youth Director, and then twice right after that as National Youth Director, serve 8 years in the youth department, and then you had to go out of the youth department. In the same way, on the executive board, you could serve 4 years as the assistant general overseer and 4 years as the general overseer, and then your term was done, and you had to leave the executive board. So this was the policy that was in place. Now, this went into effect in 1970 with the elections of 1970. And at the time it was stated, the policy started, the tenure started in 1970. So every man who was elected to office in 1970 would be allowed to be elected 2 terms, no matter how many years he'd been in office. He could, from this point forward, he can serve 4 years in that job. And so 1970 was the first election where tenure would come into play. In 1991, a petition was circulated by a teenager from the Hillsboro, Ohio church that collected 150 names, asking the General Assembly to remove the tenure of office limitation from the National Youth Department. And so that petition was presented at the conclusion of business in 1991, and a motion was made to amend the bylaws from 4 years to 6 years, from two terms to 3 terms, from 8 years to 12 years. You understand? Change. This is in 1991 that the move was made. The move was made out of order because it required a resolution in order to change the bylaws. It has to be sent by July the 1st, postmarked by July 1st, in order to be presented to the Assembly business. But the Assembly voted that year to change the bylaws and to make the tenure of office 6 years for each office, 12 years on the executive board, or 12 years in the youth department. Now, in 2011, an amendment was made to the General Secretary and Treasurer's office, to this tenure of office limitation, to allow the General Secretary and Treasurer to be re-elected up to 5 consecutive terms, so that he could serve for a total of 12 years in the office of General Secretary and Treasurer. Now, it's still stipulated that under no circumstances can any man serve more than 12 consecutive years on the executive board, but that change was made in 2011. Now, in 2016, the Assistant General Secretary and Treasurer's office was included in that 12-year limit. And so now, the current tenure of office limitations are 12 years for the office of General Secretary and Treasurer, and 12 years for the office of Assistant General Secretary and Treasurer. Mission Director and General Overseer are 6 years. Youth Director, Assistant Youth Director are 6 years. But the tenure of office limitations began with the 1970 election. So let's talk about another change that took place in 1970. In 1970, the Assembly changed its voting procedure, its election procedure. In the event that more than 2 men were nominated for an office, a process of elimination vote would take place, so that a runoff would take place between the 2 men with the highest vote recipients. What's the purpose of that? That is to ensure that anybody who is elected to the office gets a majority of the votes that are cast. You know, if you went to youth camp back in the old days of going to youth camp, they used to vote on Camp King and Queen. Now they nominate somebody from each dorm, and you might have 4 or 5 boys running for king and 4 or 5 girls running for queen. Back in the old days, you could vote for anybody that you wanted to, and so you talk about 150 kids voting for anybody they want to. Sometimes the Camp King had 12 votes. That doesn't sound very popular, right? Can you imagine the same kind of process whereby if you had 5 or 6 people running for General Overseer, for example, maybe you had 150 delegates and you had 5 guys running. It's possible to be elected with 35 votes out of 150 cast. That's not much of a mandate, right? And is that really what you could say, well, that guy had 35 votes, or you could say that guy had 115 votes against him. And so the assembly said, what we need is a process of elimination to where they took the two highest vote getters and they would have a runoff between the two of them. Now in 1998, there was confusion surrounding this process of elimination. Somebody interpreted the bylaws in such a way that instead of taking the two top vote getters, you dropped the low guy. So that if you had, for example, 6 men running, you dropped whoever had the lowest number of votes and then had another ballot, and dropped the 5th lowest vote getter and had another ballot, and dropped the 4th and then had another ballot, and so on. So that if you had 6 men running, you had to have 5 runoffs. So devastating. So in 1999, another amendment was offered to the election procedure so that if a candidate gets a majority on the first ballot, if he gets a majority on the first ballot, there's no reason to have a second ballot. If no candidate gets a majority on the first ballot, then the second ballot will be between the two with the highest number of votes. The same resolution also specified that committees and boards would be elected by a plurality vote. Majority means you got more than half. Plurality means you got the most votes. So for example, if we're electing a finance committee of 3 men and there's 5 or 6 guys nominated and running, with the 3 men that get the highest number of votes become the committee. So that the requirement for a majority does not exist on the board. The only way to have a majority is really to run them one at a time. You just have to run one member at a time. And for how time consuming that is, we decided that we wouldn't do that. And so the committees and the boards are elected by plurality with the appropriate number of attached ballots, that resolution, so that if you elected a 5-member trustee board, you have 5 ballots that are attached, that nobody votes for, nobody can vote for the same guy 5 times, as you could if they were detached. And there was also a provision added that in cases where the same number of men that constitute a committee is the same number of men who are nominated, then the provision is given that the rules can be suspended by the delegation and vote by acclamation. So it's not if you need to vote on 5 members of the resolution committee and only 5 have been nominated, then the rules provide that they can be suspended. You don't have to take a secret ballot and write the names out. You can suspend the rules and elect by acclamation. And so all of that was added to the minute book in 1999 in order to protect ourselves from the election of 2000 and the mess that we had in 98. 1986 saw the first qualifications for office for the executive board. All nominees of the executive board must have ministered successfully for a minimum of 6 years. Both the nominee and the church he is pastoring, if he is pastoring, must be supporters of the assembly program. So those were the qualifications that were added to the executive board members. In the early 90s, 92, 93, 94, there was some discussion about adding additional qualifications to the offices. Additional qualifications to the executive board, qualifications for the National Youth Department, qualifications for the committee members, and there was a resolution that was submitted in 1994. The resolution was submitted to add qualifications to all of those jobs. One resolution was submitted that added qualifications to the National Ladies Department. That resolution passed without any discussion. The resolution that called for qualifications, more additional qualifications on all the other jobs, it got killed when it was laid on the table, and it hasn't resurrected itself since then. So the National Ladies President has qualifications, and some of the other jobs don't really have qualifications to speak of. 1974, a resolution establishing qualifications for the Board of Elders was presented. Up until that time, there were no qualifications for the Board of Elders. If a man was worthy to be an elder, if he could get elected by the delegation, that's what qualified him. If you could get elected, you're an elder. In 1974, a resolution required that elders must have obtained the age of 40 years of age. If they're not at least 40, they're not elders, they're a board of youngers, right? They have to be at least 40. They must have been a member of the Church of God Mountain Assembly for 20 consecutive years, and they must have been ordained for 10 years. The following year, 1975, tenure of office for the Board of Elders was established. Before 1975, if you got elected to the Board of Elders, you were on the Board of Elders until you died, until you resigned, or until the General Council kicked you off. Most of the men who left the Board of Elders, once having been elected before 1975, most of them that left the board died off the board. There were a handful of resignations in the history of the Assembly, and there have been a handful of men being removed. Most of those removals took place early. We talked about the history of the Elder Board and how the job description, if you will, kind of changed, and the process by which they were appointed kind of changed and what have you. But most of those were early on. And so what would happen is then, with the changes to the tenure of office, is the term was set for 8 years. An elder would be elected for a term of 8 years. And every election year, every 2 years, the Assembly would elect 3 new elders each year. And so the rotation was set up in such a way that the 3 men who had been on the elder board the longest in 1975, they were the 3 that would go off the board in 76. And then the next 3 would go off in 78 and so on. And so every 3 years, we're electing 2 new elders for an 8-year term. And so that term continues. Now, in 1976, the 3 elders who had the longest tenure went off. They were Ira Moses, J. Hatfield, and Luther Gibson. Efford Enochs also resigned from the board that year. And so those 4 men were replaced with Willie Lee Parton, Clayton Lawson, J.E. Pruitt, and Fred Cornelius. In April of 77, the next year, Reverend Parton was called home to be with the Lord. And coincidentally, I may say that he and Jimmy Roundtree passed away that assembly year, and the assembly that year had a moment of silence in recognition of their passing, and that's been a tradition in our assembly ever since then, to stop in the middle of our business and pause for a moment of silence. In 77, Bobby Wilson was elected to fill that vacancy on the elder board. In November that year, James Walden Sr. passed away while a member of the Board of Elders. At the 78 Assembly, J.E. Pruitt was elected to the new office of Second Assistant Overseer. And so if you're elected to the Executive Board, your term for elder comes to a conclusion. And so with the expired tenure of George Douglas, Johnny Douglas, and Otis Ellis, that left 5 vacancies on the Board of Elders that year. We elected 5 new elders in 1978. And so Roy Cornelius, Claude Baird, Jennings Baird, Lloyd Camp, and Paul Grubbs were elected. The day after the assembly ended, James Cox Sr. passed away. Later that year, Bobby Wilson was removed from the elder board. And so in 1979, 2 more vacancies on the elder board. Johnny Douglas and J.C. Murray were elected. in 1980, the last year that the elders prior to tenure, the last three elders to come off the board, Glenn Rowe, Willis, Erie, were the last two that were left from that number. Jerome Walden and C.B. Ellis were elected in their place. Now, I mention all that to say, in 5 years' time, 14 men had been elected to the Board of Elders, and 11 of the men who were on the 1975 board, 11 of those men had been replaced in 5 years. Johnny Douglas went off the board and then went back on. And so, significant changes to the assembly and to its structure. Let's talk about the Gospel Herald real quickly. Yes, go ahead.
2 new elders every 2 years? Or
Three. Yeah. So we'll elect 3 elders in 2018. Now, let me say this also, because this is also significant. I didn't mention it in one of my notes. There's also a provision that if an elder needs to be replaced, for death or resignation or what have you, then we elect an elder to fulfill the rest of that man's term. So that every 3 years or every 2 years there's still 3 elders being elected to an 8-year term. So if a man dies in office or what, we elect a man for the remainder of that term. The man who has been elected to replace him is also eligible to run for a term of his own. So you understand that? So if a man has completed the election of another man's term, he is given the opportunity. The men who serve a complete 8-year term cannot rerun. But somewhat, so for example, this coming election year, 2018, Kenneth Massengill was elected to the office of elder 6 years ago to take the place of Jay Walden when he became general overseer. And so Ken Massengill has served 6 years. He's eligible to be re-elected to his own 8-year term this year. And so that happens ever so often. And usually it happens more, sometimes it happens because of death. Seems like in the last 20 years or so, it's happened more frequently because of election. Somebody gets elected to the executive board and has to resign from the elders. I want to talk about the denominational periodical. I had it in my notes some time back, we just didn't have time. But I want to talk about it tonight. And one of your assignments is about looking at the Gospel Herald and reading the piece on the 60th anniversary of the Gospel Herald. But I want to talk about some of the early periodicals in the Church of God Mountain Assembly or related to the Church of God Mountain Assembly. I'm going to throw the names of them up here real quick, talk about each one of them. By 1911, Jonas Shelton was publishing the Mountain Evangel in Williamsburg, Kentucky. The Assembly officially recognized that at the Assembly that year in 1911 and recommended it to the churches. And by 1928, Kurt Walker was publishing a magazine called The Gospel Standard. And I don't have the old paths in my notes. It was published, I know it was the first volume of it was in 1916. In the 1910s, another within the area of in the Williamsburg area, another magazine. The Gospel Standard was published in Georgia, where Kurt Walker was living at the time, and again, it was one of those issues where, or it's one of those that was not. It was not published by the Church of God Mountain Assembly, in that the Mountain Assembly paid for it. Mountain Assembly didn't. The CGMA did not elect an editor and did not put money into it. They weren't out any money, but a lot of the ministers and members were reading it and were subscribing to it. There's a lot of information that is available in the article that I asked you to read for the homework this week about the Gospel Herald. And so I'm going to hit the highlights and count on you to do some of the reading there. But the Elder Board met in May 1942 and authorized a denominational magazine. J. Hatfield was the General Secretary and Treasurer at the time, and so J. Hatfield was appointed to be the editor of the magazine, and he published the first issue of the Gospel Herald in July 1942. We just celebrated 75th anniversary, and the July issue, or was it the Assembly issue? I can't remember which. Just this summer, John highlighted the 75-year history of the magazine. Early on, the issue featured contributions from the local churches. Local churches would send news. There would be sermons contributed from different ministers in the assembly. The original issue was 10 pages. And you could buy a copy for 10 cents, or 15 cents, I'm sorry. Or an annual subscription was $1.25. By the second issue, they dropped the number of pages to 8. Why would you drop the pages to 8? Does anybody know?
Cost.
Well, it's much more practical than cost. Why do magazines have pages? A number of pages that's a multiple of 4 and not 2.
The way that it's,
Yeah, because of the staple. The page in the middle was getting lost, and so you know what? Let's keep it in multiples of 4. It'll be a whole lot easier that way. And so they went to 8 pages, and the subscription price dropped to $1. And so Brother Hatfield printed it in Williamsburg at the Whitley Republican. Had it printed there, and he was the editor for 25 years. In 1953, I mentioned this very briefly when we were talking about the youth department. Haskell Swain of the National Youth Department began publishing a periodical called the Youth Gateway. And its features were very similar to the Gospel Herald. While it focused on youth activity, there was a lot of other church news that was in there as well. At the 1955 General Assembly, the General Council voted the Youth Gateway out of existence, combined it and its subscriptions with the Gospel Herald. They added 4 pages to the Gospel Herald in order to accommodate the Youth Gateway section, and the price was increased to $1.50 a year. They also asked the National Youth Director to start helping with the soliciting of subscriptions. In 1962, the Gospel Herald began to appear more magazine-like. Brother Hatfield contracted the printing of the job out to the National Religious Press in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He would send it to them. They would provide royalty-free full-color covers, as well as if there was space that was available and he didn't have fill space, they would put syndicated Christian news in it so that it would fill the magazine up. And prior to this time, the magazine was a newspaper style. That was the kind of print, and there wasn't any color, and pictures were very limited. But by 1962, the pages were slick, and you'd have a color cover. Now, it wasn't a custom cover. Don't miss it. It wasn't custom. But there was basically you get clip art. You get royalty-free images that would provide a color cover. But by 1967, the assembly had grown, and the job of doing the job of secretary and treasurer was a full-time job itself. And so trying to do that and at the same time gather news, get it all assembled and edited and sent to a printer and then mail it was just too much work for one man to do. And so the assembly that year took the job of the Gospel Herald editor and gave it to the assistant general secretary and treasurer. And so since 1967, the Assistant General Secretary and Treasurer has been the editor of the Gospel Herald. Now, it's funny that it took us that long to actually give the Assistant General Secretary and Treasurer something to do. But that has been his primary job, his primary function ever since then. That year, Jellicoe pastor Wade Hughes became the editor. Brother Hughes had been assisting Brother Hatfield in and around the office for many years already, and so he assumed that job until the next assembly. In 1968, James Cox Sr. was elected. Brother Cox was pastoring the Mount Nash Church there outside of Williamsburg. That year, he increased the subscription, or the assembly increased the subscription price to $2 a year. Took 26 years to double the subscription price, but it finally happened. And Brother Cox would, in addition to regular sermons and material, he would gather together articles for print, and being able to do the job. Now, of course, he was pastoring at the same time too, but being able to do the job without the burden of all the other stuff into the Brother Hatfield was trying to take care of, gave the assembly the chance to really focus on a fine magazine. 1972, James Earl Pruitt was pastoring in Floral Avenue in Norwood, Ohio, and he became editor of the Gospel Herald during those 4 years. He had a regular column called In Appreciation of Their Many Years of Service, where he highlighted a previous leader in the Church of God Mountain Assembly. He also began featuring local churches and their histories. And in 1974, the subscription rate increased to $3. In 1976, Ray Freeman, pastoring in Rittman, Ohio, became the editor of the Gospel Herald. He would serve that way in that capacity for 2 years. He regularly featured world news and views, a column, a syndicated column that included church-related news from around the world. 1978 to 1980, Dennis McClanahan became the Gospel Herald editor. He was pastoring in High Point. At the age of 22, he became the youngest man ever to serve on the executive board. 1980, Arlie Petrie became the editor of the magazine, pastoring in Williamsburg, Kentucky. And Brother Petrie utilized the resources, the historical resources that he had available. There were a lot of sermons from the past that he was able to reprint from previous Gospel Heralds from the 40s and the 50s. The issue of the Old Paths that from 1917 was reprinted in one of his issues. A lot of historical content, as well as some of Brother Petrie's sermons and poetries and songs that he wrote. Arlie also brought the magazine to Action Printing in Jacksboro, Tennessee, and Jacksboro, Tennessee. Action Printing printed the Gospel Herald from 1980 up until 2004, all except for 2 years. And so our friends down there in Acts, of course, they printed everything for the assembly, the minute books, and all the other things that we needed, and were really good to the assembly. 1984, James Earl Pruitt, now pastoring in Whitley City, Kentucky, became the editor again. During this time, Brother Pruitt's second term, the Gospel Herald went to a bi-monthly publication. And we increased the size of the magazine, but went bi-monthly. That only lasted a year. The subscription price increased to $5 a year, but our people complained. They're so used to getting it on a monthly basis that every other month just wasn't working, and so it went back to monthly publication in 1987. In 1988, Bob Vance, pastoring in Columbus, Indiana, was elected to the Gospel Herald. He increased the number of pages to 28. 1990, Dennis McClanahan, now pastoring in Belleville, Michigan, became the editor Again, during Dennis's second tenure, he upgraded the quality of the paper and also we began printing in color on the cover. The masthead was printed in color. He printed several months at a time, just the masthead, to help with the offset of printing. It was a tricolor process, and so you'd have a blue masthead with a yellow Mountain Assembly triangle with a red flame in it. And so he was able to improve the overall appearance of the magazine in that manner. In 1996, James Kilgore was elected to he had been serving the last 6 years as General Secretary and Treasurer, and now would be elected to the position of Assistant as the Administrator of the newly launched International Institute of Ministry. Brother Kilgore was able to provide monthly updates in the magazine for the progress of the school. In 1998, Bob Vance returned to the office, still pastoring in Columbus. And Brother Vance approached the General Council in 1999 about the possibility of including a full color cover each month. And so we increased the subscription price to $10 to accommodate a full color cover, so that you could print on the cover. You could print color photographs, color pictures, anything you wanted to really on the cover. And so that move was approved by the General Council. In 2000, Middlesboro, Kentucky, Pastor Michael Padgett was elected to the office of Assistant General Secretary and Treasurer, Gospel Herald Editor. Over the next 4 years, he had a column from the National Christian Education Department, National Men's Ministry, that he added. Frequent features included a look back, reprinting from an article from the past, brief biographical sketches from some of our pastors and others, music ministry related articles, sermons of the month, book reviews, and one of the things that he did was he's the first editor to, you have to talk in the third person in case somebody's watching and can't read and realize I'm talking about me. One of the things that he did was assume all the burden of the typesetting, so that the process of getting the magazine printed was cut in half. The magazine was brought to the print shop camera ready. So it was presented. That saved the assembly some money and also saved some time. And the other thing that Brother Padgett did was he made available the Gospel Herald in an electronic format. If you wanted the Gospel Herald as a PDF, you could have a floppy disk, a 3 1/4 inch floppy disk, 3 1/2 inch floppy disk mailed to you. That was back before. I know you guys live in an email day. Can't imagine such a thing, but believe it or not. In 2004, Scott Isham, pastor of the church in Temperance, Michigan, was elected. And Scott, one of the things that Scott did was he began printing the Gospel Herald in-house. You know, printing technology has transformed so much in the last 25 years that now it's possible, and it became possible and feasible, economically feasible, to print it yourself. And so with the leasing of the right equipment, Scott Isham was able to print the magazine himself and prepare it for mailing. And John Walden is the current editor, has been since 2010, and he continues to print the magazine in-house. And it's full color, you know, from cover to cover. The Gospel Herald there's the possibility of having full color pictures on any or every page, along with colored backgrounds and what have you. Let's talk about National Ladies Ministries for about 3 minutes. I want to talk about the development of National Ladies Ministries. And we talked about the local Willing Workers Band earlier. In 1948, the Assembly adopted the local Ladies Willing Workers Bands. From the mid-1960s into the mid-1970s, the women of our organization were recognized and given an afternoon service on Thursday of our General Assembly. This was their service where they sang, testified, prayed, women ministers preached. Jesse Weaver, Susanna Harris were a couple that preached in those services, a Thursday afternoon service for the ladies. In 1976, the Assembly had a resolution submitted that year to create the office of National Ladies Willing Workers Band, and the National Ladies Organization was formed. Charlene Walden, who was the wife of our General Overseer, became the first president of the National Ladies Ministries. Linda Massengill was the wife of our assistant overseer, and she became the first vice president. Linda Barty was the first ladies secretary and treasurer. And so during their 4 years of leadership, the ladies created National Ladies Days, ladies retreats, on weekends at a different church in the assembly. The first major project, the ladies raised funds to purchase a large sign for the headquarters property in Jellicoe. In 1980, Jackie Cox was elected to the office. Jackie was concerned about the poor attendance at the ladies' retreats, and so she started having both a Northern Ladies' Day and a Southern Ladies' Day, a single-day event where they could have workshops and teaching and training for ladies. The first of these seminar-style ladies' days was held in Middlesboro, Kentucky in 1981. Pastors' wives, ministers' wives did much of the teaching. The local church oftentimes would provide a meal, and they would charge a registration fee where they would give part of that proceeds back to the local church to help in their own fundraising exhibitions. Beulah Fry was one of the vice presidents during the time, and her background in art had allowed some of the attendees to have some fun while they were there by bringing crafts and having a craft sale, a craft bazaar, if you will. They instituted national dues for fundraising, asking each of the ladies to contribute locally, and then those dues be sent to the National Ladies Ministry. Beulah Fry was elected in 1984, and she served for an unprecedented 6 years. In that capacity, Beulah was a member of the church there in Jellicoe. The Ladies' Day transitioned to more of a worship service style, from seminar style to worship service, where a guest minister would come and preach. Generally, a man would come and preach to the ladies in those ladies' days. In 1990, Paulette McClanahan became the ladies' president, and during that time at the 1993 annual assembly, the title was changed from National Ladies Willing Workers Ministries to National Ladies Ministries Department. So the National Ladies Ministries, I mentioned the tenure of office and those things that also took place, the changes during that time. Paulette would have classes, generally have 2 classes at Ladies' Day, and then a preacher would preach in the worship service. So you'd have 2 classes where the ladies could pick which class was most relevant to what they were interested in participating in. Nancy Vance served in that capacity from 1996 to 2002. During that time, they bought a new sign for the campgrounds, and they also elevated the stage at the General Assembly. The ladies raised money to contribute to that. Sister Nancy began again contributing on a regular basis to the Gospel Herald with a National Ladies page to help increase and improve communication. She also was instrumental in adding the National Ladies officers to the annual statistical letter, so that when churches lettered into the General Assembly, they could gather the information about ladies officers and addresses, so that they could correspond directly to ladies, to the local ladies departments instead. In 2002, Beverly Halcomb was elected to the office of Ladies President. One of the things that Sister Bev did, they decided that in lieu of dues, that each local ladies ministry should have a fundraiser each year and send the proceeds. It just got so hard to demand dues, to exact dues out of members, especially local members that aren't as connected to the net, but you might be able to get them to participate in a fundraiser and say, hey, let's do something, raise some money for the projects we've got going on in the National Ladies Department. In 2006, Lois Centers was elected to the office of Ladies President. During that time, they remodeled the laundry room at the campgrounds, which are a major undertaking, and some other projects. Sister Misty Hill was elected in 2012, and Sister Misty, in addition to the Soul Mile campaign, they gathered 2,500 pairs of flip-flops to send to missions. Sister Misty has created, the ladies department bought benches in memory or honor of important women. Churches could buy and pay for those at the youth camp. And so there are numerous benches around with some of the ladies' names upon them. And then also, every year at the assembly, the ladies present a double honor gift basket for the ministers at the General Assembly. And typically, they include a really nice Bible, as well as gift cards and some snacks and things like that. And so Sister Misty, in her 6 years term that's coming to an end, has really done a whole lot to help the Assembly to advance the program of the ladies. Last thing we're going to look at, and we don't have to take too long with this because it's not that long a time, the National Men's Ministries Department, Men of Integrity. In 2001, Brother Lonnie Light had a burden for men's ministry. I'll talk about that more in the next session. And to promote strong Christian male leadership, to come under the support of a pastor and to support the pastor's leadership. Henry Taylor had been serving for a long time as National Christian Education Director. And so in 2000, Brother Lonnie began to envision a National Men's Ministries Department. And so at the assembly, he approached Brother Taylor about heading up this program. Brother Taylor was well acquainted with developing a program from the ground up. He had done that for the National Sunday School Department. And so he began pioneering that work, having men's conferences, men's seminars in districts wherever he could, and also had the very first National Men's Retreat at the campgrounds in the fall of that year, 2001. And when I went back to look for the picture, I thought, man, that's a pretty good turnout for the first ever. And so there's about 30 men that gathered together for a weekend meeting at the campgrounds. Brother Taylor began writing articles for the Gospel Herald addressing the needs of men and needs of pastors. Go back and read some of the articles. When your jump drive is complete, and I add the rest of those. Brother Taylor wrote some really good articles that are related to men's ministry and pastoral support, doing the work of the armor bearer. Now, again, I mentioned that this was something that was launched by Brother Light's initiative. There was nothing in the minute book originally. It didn't start with a resolution. It started with a vision, and the Assembly, the General Fund, undergird that expense. In 2006, there was no election for men's ministry coordinator. Brother Light had been having an election after he appointed Brother Taylor, and then Brother Taylor had been reporting to the General Council and was re-elected by the General Council. In 2006, there was no election because there wasn't anything in the minute book requiring one. So in 2007, Brother Taylor submitted the resolution. It's under the Christian Education Department, under the auspices of the Christian Education Director, to create the office of Men's Ministry Director, and he served in that capacity for nearly 10 years. In 2010, Heath Hunter, who is working with Pastor Rick Massengill in Monroe, Michigan, was elected to one term between being a full-time salesman and an associate pastor. Brother Heath didn't have a whole lot of time to dedicate to the national job. In 2012, Farron Cole, pastor in Rittman, Ohio, was elected to 2 terms in 2012 and 14. In addition to men's articles in the Gospel Herald, Brother Farron also began hosting men's webinars where the men could participate. Didn't necessarily have to come to a particular conference, but everybody could benefit from the teaching and the instruction of the men's ministry program. In 2016, Pastor Jamie Couch from Ferguson, Kentucky, was elected to the office of National Men of Integrity Director. Brother Couch, in addition to our first ever golf scramble this year at the General Assembly, and the addition of Man Camp, and the first one, the Southern Man Camp, was just held a couple of months ago. The Northern Man Camp is going to be in the spring. Bringing men together for fellowship and instruction is the purpose. If Brother Couch was here tonight, I was going to ask him to share a little bit and tell us what we can expect to see over the next. Give us your 5-year plan, but just take my word for it. It's good. Let's real quickly just highlighting the leadership for the new millennium. Lonnie Clark Light was born in Fondie, Kentucky on August 8th, 1943 to James Light and Helen May Seal. Saved in 1959 at Fondie, pastored his home church from 1966 to 1972, and again from 1992 to 1994. He was ordained in 1967 by Ira Moses, George Douglas, and Willie Lee Parton. From 1972 to 74, he pastored Middlesboro, Kentucky. Brother Light served on the Finance Committee several years. He also served one term on the Board of 12 Elders. In 1994, he was elected to the office of Assistant General Overseer Mission Director, served in that capacity for 6 years, and again another 4 years from 2010 to 2014. He served 4 years as General Overseer from 2000 to 2004. Freddie Ray Cornelius was born in Cincinnati, Ohio on October the 15th, 1934 to Reverend Roy Cornelius and Mary Erie. He was saved in Detroit in a revival held by Reverend Robert Manus. Is a revival where Earl Pruitt, Carl Pruitt, Jerry Grubb, several other pastors, a lot of people were saved in that revival. He was ordained in 1961 by Paul Grubbs, Roy Cornelius, and Otis Ellis. He pastored the Monroe, Michigan church from 1960 to 2010. 50 years as Pastor Monroe. During that time, he served on the elder board for 33 years, and he served one term as General Overseer from 2004 to 2006. Walter Donnie Hill was born December the 10th, 1948 in Loudon, Tennessee to James Carl Hill and Ruby M. Parton. He was saved in Kokomo, Indiana on December the 22nd, 1963, ordained in June of 68 by C.B. Ellis and Gene Douglas. He served as Assistant Youth Director from 1968 to 74, National Youth Director from 74 to 78. He pastored the Kingston Church his last 2 years as the Assistant National Youth Director, and in 1977, as his term as National Youth Director was coming to an end, he pioneered a church in Harriman, Tennessee, and pastored that church until 2006. He currently serves and has served a total of 18 years on the elder board, in addition to 6 years as the general overseer. And lastly, Jay Walden was born January the 1st, 1963 in Kokomo, Indiana to the Reverend Jasper Walden and Mary Petrie. He began preaching at the age of 10 in La Follette, Tennessee, pastored the La Follette Church from 1984 to 1994. He was ordained in 1992 by Jasper Walden. He served as Assistant Youth Director from 1994 to 1998 and National Youth Director from 1998 to 2004. He served as the Assistant Overseer from 2004 to 2010 and was elected General Overseer in 2012 and finishes his tenure in August of this coming year. He served, in the meantime, he served 2 years as a member of the Board of Elders. This is our leadership for the new millennium, where we're at today, up to date, and we're going to take a 10-minute break and then come back to the next session.